This is Changeling the podcast. Welcome to Changeling the podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibes. I am your host today, Puka, and I am joined by special Changeling the Lost correspondent, Fetch.
Hello, everyone. I'm Fetch. Pleasure to be here with you.
So, seeing as this is, I know you've guested on the show before, and we've talked about how you are joining us for this series of episodes, but why not take this opportunity to, I guess, introduce you properly further. So, Fetch, tell us a bit about yourself.
Certainly. I'm trans. I'm in my late 30s. I live in Thailand. I got into tabletop gaming as part of general nerdum stuff. I've always loved anime, fantasy novels, and one day I was on, IRC back in the day, and somebody had me try out a LARP version of Vampire the Masquerade using digital rules. It was a pretty weird kind of game, but eventually I came back around to it in 2009. I played a bunch of D&D, started running my own campaign, found I love this, but I want to try other stuff. Got more into the running side of games, and eventually I wanted to share more about gaming with the world. I started my own Discord server where I can host all of the random games that come to my mind and also give new people a chance to run or play games. I teach people how to GM. I introduce people to the concept of safety tools, and we have a lot of fun. With CTL specifically, it's always been one of my favorite games. I got interested in it before I was interested in Changeling the Dreaming. I fell in love with the game's themes and presentation.
Mhm.
It was one of my longest running successful campaigns, and I've brought it back for a different game in Chronicles of Darkness that I'm currently running because my players just cannot seem to get enough of CTL.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's one of those games that just keeps giving. I think the reason I'm here is because I did eventually check out Changing the Dreaming thanks to the jumpstart finally convincing me it's worth a shot. And then I'm like, you know what? Actually, this is awesome. Loved it. You and Josh were kind enough to invite me on for an episode about storytelling techniques and then to bring me back for another episode. And then I was honored that my enthusiasm for CTL excited you enough to bring me around to do this slate of episodes. So thank you.
For sure, and thank you for taking part. It's funny, with the online games episode, it was when you said that someone had introduced you to the world of darkness via a LARP game online. I remember you talking about that. I was like, oh, travesty. But yeah.
Everything was wrong with the way that system worked.
I think that there are elements. So I know that in the sort of long running stream game that I was in during the early part of lockdown, it was Chronicles of Darkness, but then we had a couple like LARP derived hacks for things like dice mechanics and stuff just to streamline it. So, I mean, I think there is space for that. Maybe that'll be the theme of a future episode. But in the context of the online games episode, when we talked about the capacity of technology at different points in history, I think early 2000s trying to do that must have just been an unmitigated nightmare. So.
It's certainly an episode in itself to talk about that, and also that particular game.
Yeah.
But overall, it was a good experience and turned me on to the fun of being able to weave our own stories. And in a way, I think that, well, CTL is literally about that.
Yeah.
But if we start talking about the weird right now, I think we'll be horribly off track for the rest of the episode.
Do you know, as I started to do the intro, I was like, oh, I should say something different than Come for the Glamorous Day for the Vibes, something more Lost appropriate, but I couldn't think of anything on the spot. So next time, listeners, there will be other things.
We'll chat with our keeper, and they'll obviously make a recommendation.
No, bring it up at court. Um, so would you say that Changeling the Lost is your favorite of the Chronicles games at this point? Or is it like a contentious ranking?
Ooh, that is contentious. Changeling the Lost is my favorite game line for Chronicles of Darkness, in that every book for that game line is a winner.
Mm.
The themes are amazing, the creativity is wild. I think it's beautiful that they were able to mix fantastical elements with mundane concerns, and even some deeply troubling horror stuff that their other game lines have not touched upon, and do all that while making it unique. It's something that they refined over time, and also just a game that has broad use. Changelings are one of those splats where any given creature you look at, that vampire could be a changeling, a hobgoblin, one of the true fae keepers, or something entirely else. But competing with that is the game I'm currently run. I've taken Beast the Primordial, which is a very problematic game, at least from its core book,
Mm.
gotten together a fantastic group of players, and we've turned it into a game of deep introspection, morality plays, and also made it extremely, extremely queer. As part of that, the because Beast is a explicitly crossover encouraged game, I reintroduce my Changeling court from my first campaign. Context: the original CTL campaign, I went full anime inspiration for the court design and how the keeper worked. You got isekai'd into Arcadia.
Is there a truck kun seeming?
Oh my god, a Truck-kun seeming. I think Truck-kun in that would be one of the monsters that the Keeper uses to take you to Arcadia and then tell
That's
you,
fair.
congratulations, you're a hero. But in this context, the changing course were all very well supported, and the Beast encountered a situation where one of their problems crossed over with one of the changing court's problems, and they became invested in changeling fantasy. I got a beautiful chance to make something unique, because while Beast is a game of investigative horror and trauma and fright, there's a better way of putting that. Changeling leans towards epic fantasy, and somehow Beast is a game that can just morph to fit in with elements from the other game lines. And so the changelings, even after we resolved that main plot, a lot of them stayed on because my players liked the cute slime girl and the fiery summer court lord who carries Excalibur, and the winter queen who's a mom, but also is the terrifying aspect of coldness, death, and sorrow. So I have to say that right now, Beast is my favorite game, in that I've been running it for 2 solid years, which is longer than anything I've run, and it incorporates Changing the Lost. It almost feels like cheating to say that, but I think that's the answer I have to go with.
But that's acceptable. And at some point, maybe we'll have a crossover other Chronicles games episode or something. For the purposes of this podcast, though, I should make clear to listeners because, I mean, when we started out, I don't know that we really envisioned quite how long or quite how all over the place our episodes would end up going. But I mean, Changeling the Lost has always been a possible avenue of exploration, and it seemed like once we exhausted the dreaming books, it seemed like the natural thing to do was to start reading through the lost books. Josh, I think, was less interested in doing that, but I've played in a few Lost games. I enjoyed it. As I've said many times before on the podcast, I didn't really love it until I stopped wanting it to be dreaming. And I do think that while there is some connective tissue between the games, they each kind of occupy their own design space, their own sorts of story space. And I don't know. I think dreaming, I'm more frequently in the mood for the things that dreaming addresses. But I acknowledge that there are times and occasions when I'm more in the mood for Lost for one reason or another. So, with that in mind, doing the read throughs for this, and like, I remember picking up the first edition core book and being like, oh, and just reading through it all in one go on a 10-hour train ride up to Montreal one summer. And that was a glamorous experience, even though glamour isn't really a thing that we're concerned with in the same way here. And I mean, I bought the books and read the books, even though for a long time I had nobody to play the game with. So for me, the process of doing the read throughs has always kind of reawakened that spirit of wonder. And so going into the read throughs for this, I'm sort of on the one hand trying to remind myself what I loved about this game in the first place, and then also compare it with Dreaming all the way through. Because I do think that you can make parallels. It's like the compare and contrast exercise, right? And I would like fans of Dreaming to maybe gain a greater appreciation for Lost and vice versa. Because historically there has been some,
Uh, if I
you know,
might speak to that for a moment, I had
yeah.
a wonderful opportunity a few months ago where one of the frequent players on my own server, he loves Changeling the Dreaming, and he had wanted to try Changing the Lost, but he'd gotten a couple of bad starts with what it sounds like were storytellers who did not present the game in its best
Mm,
light. And I offered him, hey, how about if I run a one shot for you of Changing the Lost and you can see how I do it and you can tell for sure whether the game clicks. This was a fantastic experience. I got to introduce him to the game. I got to finally play with another person I've been meaning to play with for a while, who's now a standard in my Beast game. And we got to resolve a hanging plot thread from my CTL campaign without them having to know anything about the previous campaign. One of the big things out of that experience for me was helping a Changing the Dreaming player understand the differences between dreaming and lost, both in the
mm,
terminology, which has a lot of overlap and can be confusing coming into the game, and in the themes, which sometimes feel like they should be just like the ones from Dreaming, but they really aren't. By the end of it, he'd gotten something unique out of the experience, saw what its own virtues were, and also, honestly, what similarities it does bear to Dreaming. Much as the two games are very different, there is still some overlap, and
mm.
that can be in both the wonder and terror that both games can evoke.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say both games sell themselves, not sell themselves, present themselves as being about a sort of core set of things. But the more you read them and the more you go through the expansive universe of each game, the more you realize, wow, you could really get so much more into this framework. And so the overlap, I think, kind of becomes more discernible as you get more and more involved, as you become more familiar with what the foundation is, and you realize that you can build the other game's stuff into each other. Or I don't know. It's late over here, so the prepositions are failing.
You're all right. When you
uh,
mentioned, when I heard your episode for Dreaming about Arcadia, I got thinking,
mm,
are the ones from Dreaming just the true Fae from Lost? That's a topic in itself, but I don't think we've actually properly explained what this slate of episodes is going to be
Well,
covering.
yeah. So the core of it is going to be read-throughs of the books, as we've done for the Dreaming. I believe we tried to calculate roughly a dozen or 13 books for the first edition. Second edition might have to wait until next season. So that's going to be the main matter. But then, as we've done with the Dreaming stuff, there will be other opportunities to talk about inspirations, or perhaps have interviews with people, or talk about other books within Chronicles of Darkness that may be applicable to A Changeling the Lost Table. So yeah, I think this will be a major thread for season 4, because we've got a lot to get through.
I'm excited.
Yeah. We should probably also talk a little bit about the World of Darkness and how it has two meanings in this case, because I keep saying Chronicles of Darkness, but that's really second edition, and we're not there yet. And the book that I'm sitting here holding is entitled The World of Darkness, and I'm thinking, well, gosh, that's familiar.
I've had many good players who have brought the book for the wrong edition or wrong game rule to the table because the
Wah,
branding
wah.
can be confusing.
I actually picked this up at PAX Unplugged last month in the used book area. And I think this is the second printing, which I believe was 2006. So it is the first edition, but it makes reference to Vampire the Requiem, Werewolf the Forsaken, and Mage the Awakening. So it was before Changeling the Lost came out still, but I guess the other games had been established at that point.
I think they were always going to have the three main
Maybe,
songs
yeah.
out. Do
Yeah,
you
yeah.
want to start us off with the overview of what the difference is, and I'll jump in with some
Oh.
details?
All right, gather round the fire. Let's
Uh,
let's cast our minds back to the early Aughties. So essentially, here's how I remember it. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I first was getting into World of Darkness, the revised Vampire was really where they started pointing to the sense that something apocalyptic was coming. They had the Ravnos Antediluvian rise, and that caused waves. They had the Sixth Great Maelstrom, which ended the Wraith line. They had the Red Star plotline, which featured in a whole bunch of games, Changeling the Dreaming included. And for both in-game and out-of-game reasons, it kind of started to become clear that the universe was going to be drawing to a close. Out-of-game, this had to do in part with kind of the collapse of tabletop role-playing as an industry. Collectible card games had really sort of thrown everybody for a curveball, I guess. And a lot of the sort of rapid expansion that White Wolf had been doing in the 90s kind of ground to a halt. I was at a bookstore, yesterday, I guess, and I picked up St. Vitus Dances Forever, which was a sort of ghost story set in Sarajevo during the 90s, written by Stuart Week, who created Mage, and published by White Wolf's fiction imprint. And it's this bilingual book in Bosnian and English that has nothing to do with Wraith, but reads kind of like a Wraith book set in Bosnia. And when you think about, like, White Wolf was so, maybe not quite on top of the world, but so their cup overflowed so much that they were able to just put out books like that in the 90s. It's kind of astonishing to think that, now it's like, oh, we're only going to print on demand for like, you know. So yeah, there was this dramatic turnaround in that sense.
I think you've hit upon something worth mentioning to the viewers, that the World of Darkness, as I understand it, the old world as we're calling it in this case, was pushing out multiple books
Yeah.
every month. So every month you might have a new Changeling book,
Yeah.
right? And there would be one like that for most of their game lines. When the change happened to the new World of Darkness, one of the big decisions they made was to pull back how many books that they were making. The stated
Mhm.
reason was that they were concerned about quality control, that you could not put out a book a month for every game line and meet the standards that they had set for themselves.
Which is fair. For sure.
I could not imagine doing a book a month, but hey, they also had a lot of writers. Now, that did lead to a situation where, with the New World and later Chronicles of Darkness, I think you'd be getting a book a month, but it was never for the same game line. So you might get
Mm,
a book for Vampire in January, then a book for Werewolf in February, then a book for Mage in March, and a book for Changeling in April. And that's
no.
a much different pace than people familiar with the original World of Darkness would be familiar with.
And lest we forget, the original plan was for Changeling and all other game lines, not Vampire, Werewolf, and Mage, to just have a set number of books. Changeling ended up being an exception for reasons we'll get into. Well, I mean, we can just mention it was popular, so they kept
It
making them. But then things like Geist and Mummy and Demon. Beast was only second edition, right? There wasn't a first edition Beast?
correct. The second edition
Okay.
only game lines are Beast, Deviant, and
Oh, okay. So, Promethean was the other one I was thinking of. Right.
yeah, Promethean was the first of the supplementary game lines
Yes.
for New World of Darkness.
My other favorite. So yeah, that aspect of it certainly played into it. And we saw glimmers of this with games like Changeling, where it got moved into the art house imprint, which was kind of code for we're going to slowly smother this line to death.
Ugh.
But I do want to acknowledge that the in-universe rationale for this. I mean, there were interviews with, I think it was like Justin Achille and Ethan Skemp and all the other sort of people who were in the development track at the conclusion. And they said, we've been promising the end of the world since the games were launched practically. We had this, millennial kind of thing happen. With the year 2000 came and went, so it was like we had to do something for that, something momentous, and they did. But they felt like they had to make good on that promise at some point. And it was kind of like, if not now, then when? Certainly, they could have kept churning out content, probably done another edition of all the games and whatever. But I respect the fact that if they felt that they were truly done with it and they either felt they couldn't keep up the quality or couldn't keep up their own interest, that the best thing for them to do as creators and developers was to close that chapter and open a new one. I respect that. I wasn't entirely happy about how they went about it, like particularly with Changeling, but I can empathize with that feeling. The issue for me is when they then launched the New World of Darkness, it was kind of like, I mean, there were a couple of things that rankled me, which I've talked about before. First and foremost being that you had to buy a core book and then another core book. And I know we're going to talk about the first core book today, but that to me was so D&D. I was like, I don't want to have to buy a Dungeon Master's Guide and a player's handbook. So that
I'm
was
holding my
something
tongue with my own thoughts on that now. Please continue.
But then also the fact that like we had all these games that went up until the end, and then it was okay, Vampire the Requiem comes out. Everyone else has to wait. Now Werewolf comes out. Now everyone else has to wait. Changeling the Lost didn't drop until like 3 years after the launch of the New World of Darkness. So
I'd never thought
that,
of it from that perspective.
yeah,
That
and all of us fans were just like, where's our game? So
ooh.
I mean, in that interim time, that was when I discovered Shadow and Essence and had a fruitful, productive life on the forums, creating homebrew content and playing games of Changeling the Dreaming, because there was nothing else. It was like, I didn't really feel like getting into Requiem, so what else was I to do? So there's like all of that in the mix. And then the elephant in the room is what happened corporately with White Wolf. For anyone who's unfamiliar with the story, White Wolf was bought out by CCP Games in 2006, I think. And that was motivated by the desire to make an MMO based on World of Darkness. It's a very lucrative intellectual property. There had been a couple beloved computer games like Redemption and Bloodlines, so they thought they had a cash cow in hand. CCP Games had done EVE Online, which was very popular, I guess. I don't know. I didn't play it. But then the game was in development hell for years and years. They slowly drew resources away from the publishing arm. And then finally in 2011 was this wave of layoffs that really kind of killed the White Wolf publishing side. And that was when Onyx Path got founded. A lot of the people who had been either had left already or were laid off at that time They went and created Vampire 20th Anniversary Edition. They published the remaining Mage revised books, and they started the transition to Chronicles of Darkness. We can talk about the sort of licensing and stuff and what has happened since then, maybe at some point. But that's the context around it from a I don't know, I guess an ownership point of view of the IP.
I have a question or two about that. I had thought that they had started the new World of Darkness books before the CCP purchase.
They
The
did.
edition that I'm looking at shows that it was published in 2004, and I know that
Mhm.
the original World of Darkness got shuttered in 2002.
So it was still 2004. Time of Judgment came out in March 2004, and I believe
Really? Wow.
yeah, because they still had 2002 was, I believe, Year of the Scarab. So yeah, it did take time to wind down. They announced it, I think, in 2003, so it took a while for everything to kind of play out. And when we had discussed before the episode about whether they were planning, because that's the thing, like Time of Judgment was March, the core book for New World of Darkness, I think, was July or maybe August for Gen Con. So that very brief time in between suggests that there was an extensive development process already underway when they started winding down the old universe. And I remember, I think it was like, actually, it might have been August 2004, because there was a point when the old forums got completely shuttered and new forums got created for the New World of Darkness. But I imagine by that point, so even though there's that sense of like, oh, we're doing something new and exciting, we're creating this new game world, I imagine they must have already been in kind of negotiations with people to offload the company. Because like that doesn't happen overnight either. And late 2004 to early to mid 2006 isn't that long. So I don't know. It seems a little bit strange in retrospect that they were like committing to this new vibrant universe that was going to play out over several years when maybe the writing was already on the wall about their future ownership.
I had not thought of it that way. That might be an interesting research topic to work in later.
Yes.
Oh, while we're on this subject of transitioning from World of Darkness to World of Darkness, I
Mhm.
think it's worth mentioning that there's a few different terms that get thrown out because the branding was kind of all over the place. So,
Indeed.
if you don't mind my taking the lead on this one.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, Changing the Dreaming, etc. All of those are part of World of Darkness, which was the umbrella term for that universe. Now, there was an actual book called World of Darkness that I believe was just, this is interesting stuff that doesn't fit into any of our other game lines, and might have had rules for playing mortals, but it was not a proper game line in itself. You were just playing the supernatural types, and they happened to release a few general books under the World of Darkness label. But if you were ever talking about what is the setting for Vampire the Masquerade or Changing the Dreaming, you would say it's set in the World of Darkness.
Mhm.
When White Wolf, as they were then, before they had the Onyx Path Publishing split off, created this new game line to follow from the World of Darkness metaverse, they chose to call it the World of Darkness. And they opened with a book, which we'll be talking about today, called The World of Darkness. But unlike the World of Darkness book from the original World of Darkness, this one was, as you've already mentioned, a full set of rules in itself for playing a game and for specifically playing a game of mortals dealing with the strangeness of a world full of supernatural beings. It mentions the other supernaturals, but it doesn't have support for playing them. They did continue to call this new world the World of Darkness, which led to a question If I say the World of Darkness, am I referring to the game lines that are currently coming out, including Vampire the Requiem, Mage the Awakening, and Changing the Lost? Or am I talking about the World of Darkness that people are more familiar with because it's been around for 20 years, the original one? The community eventually settled upon. At first, I think the most popular differentiation was you always referred to the newer one as the New World of Darkness, and that
Mm,
stuck for a while. But the original one got stuck with the term Old World of Darkness.
yes.
That, I think, did not sit well with a lot of people who were like, it's not old to me, I'm still playing it.
Yeah.
And I think the more polite term for it these days has become classic World of Darkness. There is something which is worth mentioning for later that we might refer to, which is New World of Darkness 2nd Edition, more properly called Chronicles of Darkness. And also, I'm not sure what the proper term is for the 5th edition book lines. I think they just went back to calling it World of Darkness again without any qualifier. But thankfully, we don't have to deal with that today. Point is that, in general, for the audience, if you hear us say Old World of Darkness or Classic World of Darkness, we're talking about changing the dreaming and associated game lines. If you hear us say New World of Darkness or possibly Chronicles of Darkness, we're talking about changing the lost and associated game lines.
Yeah. Two quick points of clarification. So, in the old or classic or original World of Darkness, see, when we say nWoD, we can also mean original with that O. The book was A World of Darkness rather than The World of Darkness.
Oh my god. Oh my
And there
god.
was, not only was there A World of Darkness, but there was also A World of Darkness 2nd Edition.
Oh, that's right.
The first one was really just a vampire book because it came out, I think Vampire was the only game that existed at that point. And it was just, here are vampires around the world. The 2nd edition got a lot more in depth and kind of explored a lot more of the other splats and stuff. But yeah, it is convoluted. I think Chronicles works perfectly well as a shorthand, frankly, for talking about the other set of games.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And Paradox, I think, wants everyone to use V5 for all of the 5th edition because people
Really?
are like,
Huh.
isn't that just Vampire? And they're like, no, no, the V is for version.
Hmm.
So they claim. But in any case, one of the selling points too about New World of Darkness / Chronicles of Darkness, well, a couple selling points. First, people kind of said, oh, it's very light on the meta plot. You don't have all the baggage of the deep lore and stuff that Old World of Darkness got so entrenched in. I do think that the new games did also eventually get kind of caught up in their own lore, just not so much with like a specific set of characters and events in the same way, but that's neither here nor there. And then crossover was kind of billed as this primary feature, like, oh, it's so much easier to do crossover games, etc. Something that I had said, I think, if you go back, listeners, to episode 78, I want to say, we talked briefly about Changeling the Lost and comparing it to Changeling the Dreaming. And I believe I opined in that episode that with crossover, I felt personally as though the first edition, it was kind of more mechanical rather than setting based, and then vice versa in the 2nd edition. I think I have that right. Maybe it was the other way
There,
around.
I can clarify that. The original World of Darkness, as I understand it, they had just produced Vampire the Masquerade, and I'm not sure whether they had originally had plans way back in 1991 to make the other game lines. The focus, therefore, was just let's make the vampire book, and then Werewolf came along, and the other game lines came along, and
Yeah.
they very quickly built upon each other, became this world, and the meta plot made everything kind of congeal, but in a rough sort of way. The rule books were sometimes incompatible with each other. for example,
to
is
say the least.
botching a mandatory rule? What happens if I roll a 10 on a specialty? This ad hoc way of collecting everything caused conflicts when players wanted to have a vampire from Masquerade deal with a werewolf from Apocalypse. How do their rules and meta plot interact?
Mhm.
When the new World of Darkness came out, they made a decision at first that the idea behind having a single core book was you always start with a mortal, you always start with this consistent set of rules, and they will apply equally to all of the game lines. And then when they published the individual game lines, they made sure that all of them roughly worked the same way. So everybody had a power stat of 1 through 10, and they all had pools that started as you have 10 points of vitae or glamour or whatever, and you can spend one per turn, and this improved as you went higher. So mechanically, they were compatible.
Yeah.
Narratively, the official line was that they wanted to avoid meta plot and crossover. Everything was meant to be a toolbox even within the individual game line itself. However, over time, Metaplot did get more and more established. When we switch over to Chronicles of Darkness, the New World of Darkness second edition, that is when they flipped back to saying every game line has all of its own rules printed within it, but those rules were still intended to be the same. So if you read the rules for how extended actions work in Vampire, they should be the same in Lost still.
Mm.
However, they did at some point very clearly go, you know what is awesome? Crossover. And we got a lot of that in Chronicles of Darkness. I think for the better. But yes, it did originally just start out as we'll have mechanical crossover for if you want to do it, but we're not going to support it. And then they changed their mind.
I mean, because the fan base loves it. Like, I have to acknowledge that. I don't personally ever feel much need for crossover. People seem to want it. So I can understand them trying to shift with that breeze. It's the kind of thing which it becomes exponentially more difficult to port back in if you haven't accounted for it from the start. And I think that's true both mechanically and narratively. We saw that especially with Old Worlds of Darkness because it was like, oh, okay, now there's changelings. Okay, so now we have to figure out how they have always hitherto interacted with ghosts and mages and werewolves and vampires and mummies too, because why not? So, but yeah, I mean, in terms of the game planning, so I can say when Vampire was first being designed, Mage was meant to be kind of like Ars Magica modern era, because Ars Magica already existed. Vampire started as its own thing. I don't know what the discussions were like about integrating those two, but the Tremere, who were from Ars Magica, existed from the initial Vampire setting. So I think Vampire and Mage were always kind of there at the start. Werewolf, I always find werewolf really fascinating as like a concept because when you think about how vampires sold itself on the concept of oh, you're playing the monster, you're playing like the evil thing that you would be fighting in D&D. So then the natural next question is, well, so can I play their enemy, which is the lupines? And it's like, well, yes, now we have Werewolf the Apocalypse. So those three were like the initial, I think they were always kind of there from the start. Changeling and Wraith, and they were supposed to come out in that order, and they were Fairy and Ghost first.
Huh.
I think pretty early on, like I think that they were added to the lineup before Werewolf even came out, but they were not part of the initial conception. So,
Interesting. I did not know that was the order for those things. Good to
yep.
know.
There's little like hints of it when you see like stuff on the credits pages and in the closing essays from like the earliest books, and you're like, ah. So, but speaking of ghosts, and speaking of the ends of books, and I'm spoilering slightly, because we do have this book sitting here, or I have this book sitting here at least. I don't know if you have a physical or a digital copy.
It's all
Um,
PDF for me, especially since I moved from Phoenix, Arizona to Thailand.
that is
Tell you what,
fair. Yes.
shipping several crates of books would be
Well, I mean, so yeah, we have this core book. I guess we should talk about it because this is
probably a good idea.
yeah. So this book, it is necessary to run any of the splats, so that's a thing. But it's pretty much, I mean, it resembles a familiar World of Darkness core book. Like, you've got the fiction, you've got the art, you've got the introductory material that seems familiar. Like, it reads like a World of Darkness book. I'll give it that.
Yes, the book opens with the distinctive blue cover showing a shadowy figure stumbling away from the camera down a city street. It's a captivating image.
Hmm.
I was told once who the model was for that.
Oh.
I thought they said it was the art director for the book,
Oh.
but
I wonder if it was still Rich Thomas at that point.
the art director was Rich Thomas, though I remember. Oh, I think I see it here. That in the credits, cover photography is done by Anna Harper, and I think Anna Harper herself is the one who modeled for the person that you see on that cover.
The indistinct silhouette. Right on.
So we start off with the cover. We get ourselves a quick introduction. I take that back. This is like 8-10 page introduction about somebody getting pulled into the supernatural. And the question becomes, how weird is this world and how deep are they willing to go and how are they finding these clues?
Yeah.
We get our table of contents. And I think here it's worth noting that we're not going to talk about all 220 some pages of the book because they are largely irrelevant to our conversation about Lost, except as when they come up. But every chapter thereafter begins with a cool picture and a page of evocative text.
Can I also just point out that across from the table of contents on the credits page, we have, I think, more playtesters than I've ever seen in one place.
Really? I do see that. That is a lot of people.
Which is good. I mean, they should have had as many as they could get for this overhaul, but it's
Right.
so many playtesters.
Then we've got chapter 1, which is where we'll first be kind of doing a deep dive. Chapter 1 is mostly snippets of fiction. The cool thing about these fiction pieces is every one of them is half a page to 2 pages of content, which sets a good vibe for the game itself and may give you some inspiration. But the first time in the book that we actually get to the authorial voice coming out and then speaking to the audience directly is on page 22 of chapter 1, when the book suddenly veers from talking entirely in snippet fictions to briefly over 2 pages mentioning what kind of horror game this is. And Puka, I think you might agree that what they're going for is a little different than the style that they went with for World of Darkness.
I would agree with that. Although, as I said before, both systems can easily accommodate the other with a little bit of, flexing. It's just that they are founded on different principles as their core idea. And in this case, it feels a lot more ghost story or like uncanny than old World of Darkness did, to me at least.
Could you talk at least briefly about we've got Gothic Punk is how World of Darkness, old World of Darkness called itself, right?
Yeah.
And when we get to the new World of Darkness, they refer to it as stylish horror, which I'm excited to talk about what that is. But I think you have a better understanding of what Gothic Punk is as a tone, so that might be a good starting place for how we talk about the intended contrast in overall vibes.
I think the thing to remember with Gothic Punk is what was happening in other media at the time that Vampire in particular came out, and then some of the other World of Darkness games. Like when you think about the movies that were coming out, the TV that was out, I'm trying to remember. I do remember when I first read the Vampire the Masquerade second edition core book, which was like my first, Baby Puka's first World of Darkness book.
Aw.
And that had an extended discussion of what it meant in the context of that game. I remember it talked about Mark Reinhagen writing an outline or like a list of concepts and images that were kind of congealing into what would become the theme slash mood of the game. And there was a note that said, he realized that a lot of them reflected on the film Roger and Me by Michael Moore, which he had recently seen. And that film is very much, it's about like the Rust Belt, the hollowing out of middle America, people in desperate circumstances kind of doing what they have to do to survive. This is part of why Vampire initially was set in Chicago and that sort of area around the Great Lakes, because it had that architecture that was like the post-industrial rusting darkness kind of stuff. So like take a heaping spoonful of that, mix in some Anne Rice, because you couldn't talk about vampires in the really any time since the late 70s up until maybe fairly recently without Anne Rice being in the mix. And it's like there's that sense of raging against the state of things in the world because it is unjust in some way, but then also finding the beauty and the decay at the same time. And that deeply informed Vampire, but with each successive game, well, maybe not with Wraith. With Wraith, it does kind of fit. But like with Werewolf and then Mage and then especially Changeling, it was like, does this really work? You can make it work, but it is the kind of thing which kind of the games thematically got further and further away from. Then like history also kind of, I mean, as the 90s wore on, as we got into the 2000s, it just felt less and less of the time, I guess. I'm still a fan of it. I'm a goth kid at heart and I always will be. But you see other expressions of it nowadays. Like I know Onyx Path kind of bills some of their games as hope punk, and I'm into that. That's fine. But it doesn't have the same feel to me as early 90s Vampire. Think about like before the internet, that sense of isolation and disconnection that you didn't have a community online, maybe various sort of like social things that were happening at the time. You had the satanic panic in the mix. So like it was very much of the moment, I would say. By changing it to this stylish horror idea, I mean, I guess I'm trying to like remember what was going on in the landscape of the time, but I do think stylish horror is like a more timeless sort of thing because that goes back. I mean, that's like the classic ghost story approach, right? That's how I see it.
Yes, the stated subsets of stylish horror are a theme of dark mystery, a mood of dread, an atmosphere of threatening symbolism, and a setting of a sense of place.
I really hate those last two.
The I feel like calling it a sense of place is
It's
a
redundant, right? Like
clumsy, but right, and it just does come down to them saying, "Hey, it's modern times," and I think we kind of get that by this point.
I would say a better terminology I would have preferred would be atmosphere of false sense of security and setting this could be anywhere.
Uh,
That's like I think the vibe they were going for.
I have to agree with you on that one because
Huzzah.
what we get out of this stylish horror, which I think is a slightly odd term for what is this is a world where you don't know what you are dealing with, and there isn't a consistent explanation for anything.
Yeah.
Earlier, I mentioned that the vampire that you encounter could be at least three different things from the Changing the Lost game line. Or it could be one of the vampires from Requiem, or it could be a beast from Primordial, or it could be something completely unique that has nothing to do with any of the game lines at all. And in fact, there is at least one, I want to say several different non Requiem vampires written up in supplements.
Mm.
You are supposed to embrace the idea that your characters will never fully understand the world, and that investigating it is an inherent part of that, and that there is a danger to that. A danger I think you're supposed to find entrancing. Like, have you ever seen, I think the movie's called Angel Heart, where a detective is investigating what happened to somebody who went missing?
No, but I've seen Dragonheart starring the voice of Sean Connery.
Yes, Dragonheart, famous World of Darkness inspiration.
It is for me, but anyway, carry on.
Yes, but the point is that the deeper you go, the less things make sense. This
Hmm.
is a scary world, and they arguably capture that even better when we get to Chronicles of Darkness. And I think part of the beauty of this is that, as we'll see when we do a deeper dive into Changing the Lost, you're going to notice, audience, that much like with Changing the Dreaming, there is a ton of content. There are a lot of places to go, a lot of characters to meet, a lot of weird things that you can encounter, and almost all of it is optional. You can excise vast amounts, and that is to be expected. I believe there was a official line somewhere where someone said, in reference to Requiem specifically, no, we don't expect your city to have all 5 vampire covenants equally represented with all of their ranks filled out, or for you to have every single bloodline that we've published. That would not make sense.
Yeah.
So you'll need to embrace a sense of mystery with the world. And if you like that, if you like the idea that you as a player don't know what's going to be coming, or that you as a storyteller have the power to say, hey, there's a vampire, and I get to make up whatever that means for me for this session,
Mhm.
then you're at the core of what is going to make the new World of Darkness and its subsequent game lines exciting.
I'll acknowledge that horror as a genre relies on that sense of displacement, and I guess an arc of terrible discovery is one way to frame it. In particular, we're starting from a place of like mortal characters, so having a vampire character or a changeling character isn't something that this book gets into yet. I do think that it's easier to get on that bandwagon. I don't know what term I want. It's easier to cleave to that idea when it's just immortal, because that's the point of reference of the player. So the idea of things not being certain, things being you have to figure it out, like it's going to be this thing you've never seen before and it might eat you or kill you or whatever, and you don't know. That I think is easier for a player to get into in the shoes of a mortal character than it is with like a vampire who's been politicking for 500 years. You know what I mean? Like each of the games has their own flavor of what the horrifying unknown actually is. And the ones that kind of focus on the self, like Changeling or Promethean, are the ones that I would say interest me the most. I'm fine with it. but, but I don't know, I also kind of like the gothic punk of resisting the system and all of that. So yeah.
That's
There's
fair.
room for both, for sure.
There's different beauty to have in
Yeah.
both of the games, and like you say, you can do either in both. Like in my Beast the Primordial game, a lot of it is bad people doing bad things to bad people. So the player characters are, for example, one of the major stories was that the characters had discovered one of those camps where parents send their teenage kids who are rebellious, and it's a place out in the
Hmm.
desert where they have to do hard labor, and they basically try to brainwash them. And the group went in and they rescued the kids and did terrible things to everybody who was complicit in the bad things that happen.
Huzzah!
That, yeah, I think that nicely aligns
Yeah,
with
there you go.
gothic punk, even if it's not the necessarily the primary theme of Beast.
The one thing I want to point out before the mechanics is that there is a section. So Old World of Darkness kind of had the secret history of the supernaturals under the surface, blah, 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 stuff going on. And Chronicles had seemed, to me at least, have moved away from that. I had forgotten about this section on page 26 where it's unrecorded history, and it does kind of suggest like a lot of supernaturals pulling the strings behind a lot of things, with a
Huh.
paragraph about Columbus that has not aged well at all.
Oh, dear. Yes.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Anyway, moving on. So I would say the last 8 pages of this chapter are like the truly essential ones in this book. Maybe also chapter 8, but these little quick summaries that we get at the end, this is the meat of it.
A point as we're moving into that is that after that section about the themes, we get much more fiction again.
Yeah.
Most notably is that we get the voice of the angel, which involves a story about discovering a crypt with an angel on the moon. And this will later on
true.
turn into the whole god machine thing that people fell in love with. But I don't want to get into that in detail because that's its own whole thing. I'll just say it's a cool story, and it's worth knowing that this shows up as early as the first book in the game line. With that,
Yeah.
I'm cool with moving on to the actual
All right.
the rules.
Well, so, all right. I think it's fair to assume that even folks who are listening who haven't played New World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness have played the old one. So, they're familiar with dice pools and difficulties and things like that. What are the key differences that we can point to or innovations in this system?
Sure. The first thing to note is that the name of the system has changed. I gotta see if I remember the order. I think that the system in the classic World of Darkness is the Storyteller system,
Yes.
and that for New World, they changed it to the Storytelling system.
Not to be confused with the story path system.
Story path, yes.
Totally
boy.
different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. But point is that if you knew nothing about what the New World of Darkness system was and you made guesses based upon the original World of Darkness, you wouldn't be wholly right, but you also wouldn't be very far off. The differences, I will just straight up launch into this if you're cool with it.
Go for it.
Yeah, so like the original World of Darkness, we use D10s to form dice pools. However, we do not have a sliding scale of difficulty. In Old World of Darkness, it would technically go from 2 to 10, depending upon what game line you were using, but the difficulty would be adjusted based upon how difficult something was. In New World of Darkness, you have a consistent target number. You're aiming to roll an 8, 9, or a 10. Always. No exceptions, except Mummy, but we don't need to talk about that.
First rule of Mummy is you don't talk about Mummy. And that's true for every edition of the game.
Folks might remember specialties from the classic World of Darkness, where if you had a 4 in an ability or an attribute, or occasionally even a power stat, Mage very specifically let you do it for the spheres, and you rolled a 10, then you would get 2 successes instead of 1. Unless we're talking about Wraith, in which case you re-roll the die. But again, hey, the books weren't always consistent. Point is, in New World of Darkness, if you roll an 8, 9, or a 10, that is a success. The difference here is that regardless of whether you have a specialty or not, a 10 has a rule called 10 again, which means that you re-roll the die, and if it comes up as an 8, 9, or 10, you get another success in addition to the one you got from the first 10. And yes, if you roll a 10 again, you re-roll it again, which is how sometimes you might roll 3 dice and get 7 successes. Pretty cool. Specialties, by the way, just in this game, all they do is they add 1 die to your pool. You have 4 categories of success and failure in the New World of Darkness. You have your basic success and failure, but you also have an exceptional success and a dramatic failure. In the original World of Darkness, the number of successes you got usually did not directly affect the result. If you got 1 success to pick a lock or 5 successes to pick a lock, you still picked the lock. The difference was that a single success was considered marginal. So maybe there's going to be some guard nearby or evidence of the tools, or you just look a little bit silly doing it because you barely managed to get the thing open in time. Whereas if you got 5 successes, shoot for the moon. Say that you twist it, flick it, and then boom, the door opens up and there's not a guard to be seen. Really abstract. By contrast, in nWoD Darkness, there is the similarity in that for most actions, your number of successes do not matter until you get 5 successes, which is considered an exceptional success. An exceptional success gives you some extra benefit. With powers, it often means that they work better or have an additional effect. With mundane actions, it's still abstract, but you're supposed to give the player something for doing it. So, for example, if you were picking a lock to get into a place and you rolled an exceptional success, you might specify there is no evidence that I picked this lock, or that if any guards come by to look at it, they suffer a penalty to notice that something had happened. A dramatic failure is similar to botching. Depending upon which book you were reading in Old World of Darkness, botching was either a mandatory or optional rule, whereby ones would subtract from your successes. I think that part was always standard, but I'm not sure. The part that was definitely optional in some was if you rolled at least 1 1 in your pool and you did not get any successes, then that was a botch, which means that something terrible happens. So, for example, if you were trying to jump over a fence and you got a failure, the GM might say, you can't get over the fence, you got to go another way around. Or you get over the fence, but take a point of bashing damage as you clumsily fall over on the other side. Whereas if you botched, the GM would do something more drastic, like say, you try to climb over the fence, but your clothes get caught, you're suspended upside down, and now you see the flashlight of the guard as they're coming around while you're trapped in this. What do you do? Similarly, a dramatic failure would give you those same consequences. Ones do not subtract from successes in New World of Darkness. I pause as the audience breathes a sigh of relief. Instead, if your dice pools have modifiers, which I will explain in a moment, if your dice pool for a roll would ever be 0 dice, then you roll a chance die. A chance die is a single die where a 2 through a 9 are a failure. A 10 is a success, and you do get to re-roll it and see if you get another success. But if you roll a 1 on that chance die, then you suffer a dramatic failure, in which case things go as badly as I described with the botch. I had mentioned modifiers. Pools in the game are usually attribute plus skill. These traits go from 1 to 5. All of you are familiar with attributes. That's your strength, your dexterity, your stamina, etc. But the spread of 9 attributes is different in New World of Darkness compared to Old World.
Partially different.
Partially, yes. They are separated into rows and columns. So you have physical, mental, social attributes. That part is familiar. But then you also have power stats, which, I'm going to look this up. Otherwise, I'm going to get this confused because
This is one of the few things that I know off the top of my head. So I was like,
I'm going to let you handle this one then. Go ahead, give me the power attributes, the finesse attributes, and then the resistance attributes.
So the power attributes are intelligence, strength, and presence for mental, physical, and social, respectively. Then finesse is wits, dexterity, and manipulation. And resistance is resolve, stamina, and composure. So resolve has replaced perception, presence has replaced charisma, and composure has replaced appearance. It really boils down to like raw strength that you have in one of those categories versus the delicate manipulations that you can do versus the defense that you have.
That's a perfect summary of it. And some might be going, thank God appearance is no longer a stat, but others of you might be saying, but what if I want to be pretty? And good news is, merits still exist in this game, and we'll talk about how they're a little bit different, but short version here is there is a merit called striking looks, which is explicitly, I am pretty, or I am extremely pretty, and I get a dice pool bonus when that is relevant.
It's also worth pointing out with merits, merits kind of function as a combination of merit and background, to use the old World of Darkness terms. Like they have dots, they're generally 1 through 5. I think it's the social ones are where you would find backgrounds like allies, resources, etc., because they're divided into mental, physical, social. But then, importantly, you can also raise them over the course of the game with experience points. So I actually quite like how they handled that system, I guess, because in old World of Darkness, merits and flaws often just become freebie point economy. And backgrounds, too, for that matter, sometimes become that.
We're on merits now, so let's talk about
Yeah, sorry.
merits, and then we can come
I
back.
skipped
Oh,
ahead.
we can talk. We can come back to skills. I think that's fine. So in Old World of Darkness, you have merits and flaws, which I think are always optional. Are they optional in C20?
Yes. They are always 100% optional, and never let a player tell you otherwise, storytellers.
They are 100% optional, but I don't know of any table that has not encouraged their use in World of Darkness.
I will say that I've generally avoided them in one-shots, because it rarely seems
That's true.
fair or worth it.
The merits and flaws in World of Darkness were meant to fill in quirks for a character that could not be represented by general traits. Like, how much money do you have? Or who do you know? Or do you have an awesome magical artifact? Or conversely, are you cursed? Are you a social outcast? Do you suffer from nightmares? The system is always optional in that one. When we get to New World of Darkness, merits and flaws still exist. Flaws are still optional, and merits are now a standard part of character creation. Merits are rated on a scale of 1 to 5, but unlike attributes and skills, not all of them have the full range of 1 through 5. For example, common sense is just 4 dots, and if you want striking looks, that costs you either 2 or 4 points. These will cover a variety of things that you might want to see on your character. And in general, I think it's better formatted than the way they handled merits and backgrounds being separate concepts in Old World of Darkness. I think that compressing those into a single system was a good move. Flaws are optional things that in this game do not grant you more stuff at the beginning of making your character. They just give you additional experience points if they become relevant. We can talk about our favorite merits in a moment, but I do want to go back to skills for a second because this is part of the basic pool. So we have attributes, which we've covered, and we have skills. Skills are like abilities from the old World of Darkness. They just change the name and they recategorize everything. So instead of having talents, which were inborn traits, skills, which were things that you had to study to pick up, and knowledges, which are things that you had to learn, a system of classification I find dubious. They have instead changed it so that you have mental, physical, and social skills. The skill set is different. Mental is academics, computer, crafts, investigation, medicine, occult, politics, and science. Physical is athletics, brawl, drive, firearms, larceny, stealth, survival, and weaponry. And social is animal ken, empathy, expression, intimidation, persuasion, socialize, streetwise, and subterfuge. Those of you who paid attention to your rules for abilities in World of Darkness may recall that if you did not have a talent, you can always use it without penalty. If you did not have a skill, you could use it at an increased difficulty of 1. If you did not have a knowledge, you could not use it at all. In New World of Darkness, however, both physical and social skills suffer just a -1 penalty, and mental skills suffer a -3 penalty. There is no rule about saying you cannot use them. I think they make an exception for, like, okay, how does your character know this if they've never learned anything about medicine?
Although, to be fair, if you don't have a mental skill and you're losing 3 dice off whatever attribute you would be rolling with it, chances are you might not have any dice
That
anyway.
that's pretty good. Unless you decided to invest very heavily in your
Yeah.
intelligence stat, you're probably going to be failing that roll. So it kind of
Yeah.
works out the same way. That is a good call out.
Did we mention also, because we're talking about the base mortal build here, there are just fewer dots to go around because it's 543 and 1174 for attributes and skills respectively. And I believe when you do the supernatural template on top of that, you add a couple more to kind of bring it up. But
Sort of, yes. In World of Darkness, the answer is very directly yes. That if you play Immortal, you have so many points in your attributes and abilities. But if you're playing a Supernatural, you just straight up get a lot more in both of those categories. The difference in New World of Darkness is that the starting attributes and skills are always the same, whether you are a mortal or a supernatural. You get, for attributes, it's 5 in your primary category, by which we mean physical, mental, or social, 4 in your secondary, 3 in your tertiary. For skills, it's 11, 7, 4. And the fifth dot of any attribute or ability is always going to cost an extra point. So you're
okay.
very rarely going to have a character who is out of 5 unless you're really willing to sacrifice something for your character. The templates do add things. I'll be honest and say I do not recall what they did for first edition changing the loss off the top of my head. But I know that, for example, in second edition, your different changing subtypes would grant you a additional dot in an attribute. Or
Yeah.
Mage the Awakening would automatically give you, I think, at least 1 dot in the occult skill as part of your background. So the template itself will add some points. I'm not 100% sure that happens in first edition. I want to say yes. Even if it does, it works differently for
Well,
every one of
we'll
them.
find out soon enough.
You get to pick 3 specialties, which again just add 1 die. Your dice pool is typically going to be no more than 10 dice, an attribute plus skill, but there will be exceptions to that. Primarily, that comes from modifiers. Old World Darkness, you had a flexible target number, so by default, the challenge for something would be a 6. But if I felt like it would be hard to climb over this fence because it's raining, I might say that's going to be difficulty 7. Conversely, if there was something making it easier, like you still have to climb over that fence, but there's these rickety boxes you can use to give yourself some leverage, I might lower that difficulty to just being a 5. In New World of Darkness, you instead have modifiers to your dice pool. This is a thing which sometimes comes up in the classic World of Darkness games, but is far less common. Modifiers will be something like, it's raining, therefore, when you roll your dexterity plus athletics to climb over the fence, I want you to subtract 2 dice from it. Or if you have those boxes, I might say add 2 dice to your pool for getting over. Modifiers rarely go above or below +3 or -3. +3 or -3 is equal to gaining or losing a success on an average roll. Beside that, you have some similar actions from the game. Instant actions, contested actions, and extended actions basically work the same way as they do in the old world of darkness. Your health track, it works a little differently. You no longer have a set of, I believe it's 7 health levels automatically, each of
Mhm.
which has its own name, like bruised or maimed, and its own dice pool penalty. Instead, you have a number of dots of health equal to your size, typically 5 for a human, plus your stamina, which means that an average character's stealth can range from 6 to 10. And you only suffer penalties in your last 3 boxes -1, -2, -3, respectively. Also, they changed the way that damage types work. In Old World of Darkness, I think it depended upon the game line, but did aggravated damage exist in World of Darkness?
Oh. Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
Very,
so
yes.
in New World, there is bashing, lethal, and aggravated. Bashing is just I punch you or I hit you with a blunt object like a baseball bat. Lethal is I slice you with my claws or I stab you with a knife. Anybody can suffer bashing or lethal, regardless of whether you're a mortal or a supernatural, barring some supernatural trait that says otherwise. Aggravated damage is a unique damage type, which typically comes from a supernatural creature's bane, like if you set a vampire on fire or push them out into the sun, or certain supernatural powers might just inflict aggravated harm. And the difference with that is it's very difficult to heal, and it is very clearly supernatural, like the skin melting off of your
Mhm.
body. But Puka, I don't remember how bashing, lethal, aggravated works in Old World of Darkness.
I mean, much the same way. It is an invention of the revised edition, because before that it was just regular and aggravated.
Really? Huh.
Yeah, I think it was Vampire Revised introduced it, and then they've kept it up. But something that I wanted to bring up was the vice and virtue system and the morality, because one of the complaints that Old World of Darkness, Vampire in particular, got dealt pretty often was the humanity system and the hierarchy of sins. And I think some people balked at the idea of there being mechanized morality, period. I've never really had a problem with it in principle, but the way that it's executed, I feel like has never sat right. This is no exception. Especially like the hierarchy of sins. I'm always like, I would much rather steal something than hurt someone, but I don't know, maybe that's me.
As a good friend of mine once observed, even if you subscribe to this system, the actual starting value that most people would have would be significantly lower than what
Right.
what they claim people would be unwilling to do at character creation.
Right.
It's a very
It's like, can I take humanity 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and 9 and like skip the others? Anyway,
Your complaint about this eventually becomes a concern that they will address in second
yeah,
edition, where they replace the hierarchy of sins, which are a very questionable basis, with the idea of integrity, which is
yeah.
how well do you hold yourself together and have a sense of identity in the face of everything that's challenging that. And that does work better, but that's a separate thing. And then there's virtue and vice, which replace things like legacy or nature and demeanor.
And I do actually I love these. I really
Okay.
do. There was also a book recently released on the Storyteller's Vault where somebody dramatically expanded these. I don't know if they ever
Oh,
did expand them within the canon.
they did.
Okay.
So in first edition, Roll of Darkness, we have just the classic 7 vices and virtues. Then in the Chronicles of Darkness, the second edition, they say you're totally welcome to use those. We're still using the term virtue and vice, but It can be whatever you want it to be.
Hmm. Okay. Well, I can accept that. I do. I mean, I like the nuance of some of the archetypes in nature and demeanor and in legacies. And I don't know. I guess I don't need those to be mechanized in any particular way, but there's something about having the nature visionary and the demeanor loner or whatever that doesn't necessarily translate into, okay, your virtue is charity, you know? But I do like it as a system. I think it's elegant. For anyone who's reading through the book, the virtues and vices are like chapter 4 and skills are chapter 3. So like we are bouncing around a little bit. But briefly, I wanted to just point out also chapter 3, the skills. If you're ever at a loss for like what a particular skill might do, this chapter has you covered because there is so much freaking text for like all of these skills. It's like, how complicated could drive be, really? Well,
Oh
have
boy.
I got news for you? It is nice though. I mean, for anyone who's really truly unfamiliar, there are examples and we've had before in previous World of Darkness books, it would be like, okay, well, a role to do stunt driving or whatever. Here's a few sentences about it. Here's the suggested dice pool. In this instance, it would be like, no, let's do an entire 2/3 of a page about that. And let's have a little sample fiction. And let's talk about what a dramatic failure and an exceptional success look like. So it does go really in depth for those. So I wanted to call that out.
They are, yes, very, very good at that. Also, side note, cars are the most dangerous weapon in the game, sometimes even to your players themselves. It's a meme in my games that somebody always needs to take drive, or if I call for a drive check, that's going to end the campaign.
Well, and that kind of points to moving to chapter 6 for a bit. So that's like where the dramatic systems, things like everything you've been saying about the dice pools and the types of action and everything. We have a similar time system with turn, scene, chapter, etc. But there's so much about objects here, and I suspect this came from the considerable lack of specificity in Old World of Darkness about these things. So you have the durability, size, structure, and damage traits for basically everything, from a baseball bat to a cat. Like it's just very extensive.
Wait, they put living animal. Wait, they give durability stats to
I might
living
be
animals?
overstating. Let me flip to the animals
Okay.
spot. Okay, no, animals just have regular attributes and stuff, but yeah, like I mean, there are examples for like things that I've certainly never felt a need to assign a durability score to. Chain link fence, tempered steel, wooden chair, coffin, bank vault. And it's useful. I mean, if you are playing that kind of game where you need to mechanize those things, then great. What I worry about for a new storyteller entering the system, even though we're now 20 years out from it, is like if you are not someone who is improvisational, I feel like it would become very easy to get bogged down in the numbers of this. And the corollary to that is players squeezing the system within an inch of its life to like, I'm going to break that door down. You know what I mean?
I think the best compromise that you could do in a situation like this is the advice I give to every new storyteller, which is start with the absolute basics. You can
Mm,
go to the summary of the game rules from like pages 20 through like pages
yeah,
like 30
yeah,
through 40 and use that as your reference for most of the game. You can simplify everything down to figure out attribute plus skill, make a roll, and see whether you get a success or a failure. That is absolutely the best way to keep yourself from becoming overwhelmed. And then when you feel more comfortable with the game, or you encounter a situation where you want to add more nuance, or a player calls out something interesting, that's a good opportunity to delve into these systems. I think if you
yeah.
try to jump head first and memorize everything, you're going to stress yourself out.
This is kind of a an oblique question to this discussion, but since I think you've certainly gamed more in the New World of Darkness, Chronicles of Darkness games than I have. I guess comparing the play experiences of the two settings, really just in terms of like the dice and the rolls and the pools and all of that, how would you distinguish between them in terms of, like, to use one of Terry Robinson's favorite phrases, the mouthfeel? How would that differ? Because my sense is that with Chronicles, you tend to have fewer successes, which doesn't really matter so much. It's almost like they realized that the difference between one success and five successes in Old World of Darkness, unless it was spelled out explicitly, it didn't really do anything.
Right.
And they wanted to address that, but in the exchange, they kind of, and I haven't like hashed out the math or anything. My sense is just that you tend to have fewer successes on your rolls, and that's okay.
I feel like the fluctuating difficulty system in the original Rule of Darkness is it's actually easier for me personally to
Oh, me too.
conceptualize. I just write some things on a scale of 1 to 10 and
Yeah.
I say there you go.
Yeah.
Whereas with the dice pool modifiers, it's flimsier. And I've
Mm.
also found that sometimes players who are new to the system coming from World of Darkness get frustrated because you are often rolling the same number of dice, but you
Mm.
are less likely to get a success at all
Right.
because your target number is always an 8. In the end, I think that's more of a perception issue than a practical problem because, I mean, in the original World of Darkness, ones will subtract from your successes. I've had plenty of rolls where somebody happily rolls 8 dice against difficulty 4 and they get 3 9s and 4 1s and they go, well,
Wah, wah.
womp womp. In the end, I think that the Chronicles system runs a little smoother, even though I think I prefer fluctuating difficulty conceptually. I think the biggest flaw of the New World system is that while there's a lot of modifiers, it can still sometimes be hard to adjudicate how much to increase or decrease the
Mm.
modifiers. And that, as we might see in later books, there will be situations where unique systems or powers will give you huge modifiers that maybe do not play nicely within the bounds of the system.
And combat must just be infuriating. I mean, I remember combats, but yeah, I mean, it's infuriating in a different way, but it's still infuriating.
I'm
So
going to say that I think most people would like the New World combat more than the Old World. And I
really,
feel, well, Puka, I am a big fan of reverse declarative initiative, which is the actual system for the original World of Darkness.
you're one of the few.
I know, right? Because most people do not realize this is how it actually works. Here's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to all roll your initiative, and then from lowest initiative to highest initiative, you declare what actions you are doing, which means that a person with a higher initiative can declare an action that messes up your lower initiative action. For example, if you're going on 1 and you say, I'm going to shoot my opponent, your opponent can say, okay, well, on my turn, what I'm doing is I'm just going around the building and into a room and closing the door. So your action's effectively wasted on me. And
Yeah.
there's not very much you can usually do about this. And then you take your actions in the order of descending.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody other than myself who uses this because it's hard to remember that and honestly kind of too complicated. So what most people really do is the way that New World Darkness handles it, which is you all just roll a d10, you add your dexterity plus composure to that, and that's your initiative, and then you just declare and take your turn in descending order. It's pretty simple.
Oh, no, I mean, that part of it for sure. The part that frustrated me about nWoD combat was more like if you get one success on your hit, you're lucky. Because, like, the contested roll is always just frustrating. I mean, you're already operating under a lower success threshold, generally speaking. This is just my experience. It might be different for, like, werewolves or something. But I found combat to always be basically like the least effective option for getting things done. Which, that's fine with me. I'm not a combat head. But when I'm forced into combat and I've built a character who's not built for combat, and I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to stand here swinging at the air until everybody else gets their stuff done.
I feel like it'd require a longer conversation to really get into this.
Yes.
But for now, I'll say
we can table it.
Okay, in Old World, I roll my attack roll, and I have to hit a target number depending upon the weapon that I am using.
Yes.
And then my opponent can choose to use one of 3 defensive maneuvers, which have their own target number, and their successes will subtract from my successes. Then, if I have any successes left over, I roll my damage pool, which is ascribed underneath the weapon. And I think you add your extra successes to that damage pool. And that's always against a difficulty of 6. And then your opponent rolls a soak pool, which is typically just their stamina, if they're allowed a soak pool at all.
Mm-hmm.
And any successes from that subtract from your damage. That's a lot. In New World of Darkness, they simplify it to you still roll your attack pool, but it's always against the standard difficulty. The weapon you have is a modifier to your dice pool. So your average handgun will typically add, say, 3 dice. And your opponent has a defense that you just have to beat. The defense will be the lower of their dexterity or wits. So for your average person, you are rolling against a defense of 2. If you have a decent weapon, you probably have 4 or 5 dice. Or if you're wielding a gun, you just ignore their defense entirely. And once you roll your damage, which is, I think it's just your successes, are automatically inflicted as damage on the opponent. They do not get soak. The only thing that can block that is armor, which directly reduces. That is how combat basically works in New World.
Well, the way that it's shaken out for me in my play experience is that 90% of the time, I'm lucky if I get 1 point of damage through.
Oh, geez.
So, in any case, yeah, we can maybe have that as a longer discussion some other time. Because I do want to get to Chapter 8.
Yeah, storytelling, right?
In the interest of time, I would like to focus on a couple greatest hits in this chapter, because I do think this is the other valuable chapter in the book, next to those 8 pages from Chapter 1. So there's kind of a rehash of narrative structure in here. They talk about conflicts and antagonists, theme and mood and stuff. But they also have on page 194 these 10 commandments of storytelling, which I just kind of want to read out because they're short and sweet and I think kind of sum up a lot of stuff.
Go for it.
The 10 commandments of storytelling. Involve players whenever possible. Be aware of players' expectations. Work things out in advance. Story first, rules second. Description, dialogue, and action. Avoid stereotypes. Be fair to your setting. Don't tell them everything. Don't abuse your power. And don't panic. And I think that's a very good way of putting a lot of the important parts of storytelling. And like there's more description under each of those, like a few lines, but as a top level guidance thing, yeah, I'm into that.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Notably, while this book gives some good advice, especially under the 10 Commandments, about making the gaming table a positive experience for players, it will be later books that get into the concept of safety tools. Safety tools were still novel at the time, and I don't know if they show up explicitly in any of the first edition books, but I'm pretty sure they've always made an attempt to talk about safety even before they had the exact verbiage that we use nowadays, and they only get better about that as they go along.
Yeah, it was still kind of a fresh idea in 2004, I guess.
Beyond that, I just love the storytelling chapter for how much storytelling advice it gives you. For a book where there's nothing really about vampires, werewolves, mages, they throw a fantastic number of story hooks at you for weirdness that you can use to jumpstart a game of mortal investigators, which is what this game is about. Later, they introduce Hunter the Vigil, which is, in a way, a spiritual successor to like Hunter's Hunted or Hunter the Reckoning. But in the base game, you're typically just some random mortal who's gotten caught up in the supernatural and you are investigating it. And they give a ton of fantastic advice and specific examples to jump into it, which gets us to, do you want to talk about ghosts?
I do want to talk about ghosts. I want to throw in one more thing about storytelling too.
Of course.
I'm glad that they have like the mechanics of putting together a story, and then separately the mechanics of putting together your first story, which I think is a very wise choice. So props to them for calling that out.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. And the story ideas really do tap into those eerie horror vibes, because it is this system that's keener on psychological horror than the secret history stuff. So
Yeah, if you didn't get it from the first chapter, you'll definitely get it by the storytelling.
yeah. So yeah, ghosts kind of get thrown in here at the end. There are other antagonists ranging from a raven to a SWAT officer. But then the second to last little bit of this book is just kind of slipping the ghosts in. It's interesting because they're kind of like abbreviated full characters. They're missing some traits. They have powers, but they're just kind of these flat abilities called noumena, sort of adapting the Arcanoi into noumena. They have glimmers of Old World of Darkness here, like instead of the shroud, you have manifestation modifiers. So depending on the place that you are, it is easier or harder for a ghost to manifest itself. But then there are these bits about how to deal with them. And it's this, if you're going to run a mortal game, but you want some veneer of the supernatural, this is like the little taste to get your characters involved. And it's an interesting choice because they didn't end up making a ghost game. There's Geist, which isn't really about the ghosts, right? So it's like, here they are.
To slightly expand upon that, correct. There is no exact Wraith analog in New World of Darkness. Many books will deal with ghosts, and there is a supplement called Ghost Stories for the first edition. But the real quote unquote ghost line is Geist, and that is about somebody who dies, meets basically a weird spirit slash ghost, merges with it, and comes back to life. And
also known as Mummy the Resurrection.
Don't get me started. I have a lot of fun things to say about the cool high concept of that one. But with Geist, the whole point is that you are helping ghosts pass on. You're giving people second chances, but you're not playing the ghosts. They will later have rules in some of the games for how you can make a ghost PC, but it's never something quite like what you get in Wraith.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm fine with them being in here. I think like I maybe would have liked to see like cryptids as well or something. Just kind of these antagonists that don't neatly fit into any of the games that eventually came out. I mean, I guess the fact that there was eventually a Ghost Stories book is good. It's interesting to me that the thing that people would be approaching this setting for, because generally, even if you're playing a mortal in this setting, you want to be encountering the supernatural if you're a player. Like, that's what draws people to World of Darkness. It's just kind of rather thinly described. You know, it's a handful of pages in the storytelling chapter, and there's not really much to do with it. So I would have liked it to be a little bit more robust, I suppose.
That's a good point. The silver lining in this is that later books do introduce a lot of other things. You have antagonists, you have urban legends, and when they finally get around to doing the second edition of Chronicles of Darkness, they do introduce cryptids, which includes my favorite, the Jersey Devil, who is just who is a devil but also a bro. It's quite a read.
And then we get experience at the end, which, all right.
Yeah. In brief, experience works like it does in Old World of Darkness. You have multiplicative experience, so the more expensive something is, the harder it is to buy after character creation. You earn XP the same kind of way. Did you do something awesome in the session? Did you embody a flaw is the new one that you get for that. You don't have freebie points, so you'll just have to make sure that you spend things the way that you want at character creation, and then deal with the costs when they come up.
Where do you stand on the whole players arguing for their own XP awards thing? Or for each other's XP awards? Like, I think so-and-so role played great.
I don't think it's a great thing, but that's actually part of a bigger issue I have with it. I do not like the idea of players having to argue either for themselves or for others' experience points. Once
Yeah.
upon a time, I ran Aberrant First Edition, and I ran into a
Ooh.
problem where no, it was a fun game, but I ran into a problem where I was like, I'm gonna do this as honestly as I can by the book, where hey, this person did a great job role playing this session, so I gave them more XP. This person really showed off the session, they gained more XP. And there came a point when two of the four players approached me and said, hey, we can't help but notice that we're like way behind the experience of everybody
Yeah.
else. What's going on? And I had to have a very uncomfortable conversation where there's no way around it. I was basically saying, yeah, you guys just kind of weren't doing as much cool role playing as everybody. And I wasn't trying to be mean or pick on or bully them. I was trying to go off of
Yeah.
the adjudication the book gave me, but that felt bad for everybody involved. In
Yes.
the way I prefer to do it nowadays is I'll either give a standard amount of experience points, or what I like to do even more is I will look at that chart and we'll do our stars and wishes at the end of the game. And then we'll say, hey, who here thinks that they hit one of these moments? We put all the experience into a big pile, and then we just distribute that equally among the players. That way, one person's cool moment benefits the entire group.
Oh, I like that. All right. Yeah, that's neat. And thus endeth the book.
Sure. I think we should talk briefly about art and then
Oh, yeah.
final thoughts.
Do you have a favorite art piece?
I've already mentioned the cover. Some other pages for people to look at. Page 31, the voice of the angel, the sarcophagus picture of the angel coming out on the moon while astronauts are looking at it. Beautiful. Page number 77 features a rather graphic image of a robber leaping down at a woman and her raising her umbrella to jab him in the eye. That one is, oh boy. Page 111 features a two sequence fight, which has a great one beat and then follow up beat. Highly recommend looking at that. Starting on page 182, there is an example of play, which is a fantastic thing to have in any game. Honestly, I do recommend looking at that regardless of what game you're in.
Necessary.
But it shows a full sequence of events happening to a character, and that was beautiful. And finally, there is this image on page 198. It shows
a figure.
yeah, there's a figure, a monstrous figure that is crawling towards a wheelchair that is framed in front of a very bright background, and the figure itself is in darkness, and it's not clear what's going on with that. It just looks unsettling, and that one's always stuck with me.
I'll just throw one more in. There were a couple. I did like a couple of those, but I actually really like 137. I don't know why. It's just this woman kneeling on her kitchen floor holding a blade with which she has just stabbed, apparently to death, a creature that we can't see except for its massive talons in the foreground. And something about that image I just find very arresting.
I think
Yeah.
her expression has a lot to do with it. She
Yeah.
looks like this is her first adventure, and the adventure began with some monster surprised me. I stabbed it. I fall into my knees, and I am currently processing that the world does not work like how I thought it did.
Yeah. It's sort of the sort of scream queen surviving and becoming a badass or whatever. But
yes, the final girl kind of thing.
yeah. I also like 158. I don't know what is going on, but it's just very like, ooh.
158, that is the... Oh, yeah, that's the one next to the grappling rules.
Yeah. Some kind of demonic thing sucking the life out of somebody, trying to stab it. I don't know.
And looks like he's got some sort of weird weapon in there. It's certainly a memorable image, but it's also very confusing.
Yeah. Perplex. Anyway, yeah, overall impressions. I mean, oh, sorry, one more. The Ghost on 209. Also.
That one is... Oh, yeah, the woman who's emerging as the dude is kneeling before the candles.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, overall impressions. So I think I've mentioned before how when I used to play Changeling First Edition back in the day, we were all kind of bitter and angry, and we refused to buy the corebook. No, not all of
Yes,
us.
it hurt my brain when you said that.
Well, because it was kind of like somebody explained to me how the dice mechanics had changed, how character creation was a little bit different. I think probably I was guided through character creation. And then it was like, okay, well, I know how to do a dice pool. I know how all this other stuff works. Like, I was able to intuit everything else that I needed. So this was my first time really sitting and reading through the core book. And the thing that struck me first was like, oh, they wasted so much time on this. But I tried to be a little bit more, thinking about people who are approaching the system for the first time. And I do think it is very helpful for them to have gone this in depth with things like the skills chapter, with things like the storytelling chapter. I'm still not convinced that it needed to be its own separate core book that the others then all built on. That being said, I'm glad that all of the combat rules are taking up space in this book and not in every other core book to the same extent, even though I think there are some notes about it. I'm glad that attributes and skills don't need to be rehashed in every single core book. So ultimately, it saves room in all of the games that would follow, and I appreciate that. Mood wise, I mean, like I said, stylish horror, cool. I like gothic punk just as much.
Right on. My final impressions are this was really my introduction to World of Darkness. While I had done a bit of like that LARP I mentioned previously, this was what I first got into, and it hit exactly where I needed. I loved the toolbox approach. I loved the mystery of what's going on in the setting and how much freedom that gave me, and the dark vibe. It set me on a path where I could tell fun stories just about mortals getting caught up in weirdness, but also go on to tell cool stories about vampires and werewolves and changelings. I feel like the book itself is overall pretty well put together. There are some pieces that haven't aged well, but those seem to be
Yeah.
mostly artifacts of, I mean, come on, it's been, literally 20 years now. We've moved on, and thankfully the company seems to have generally gotten better about the keeping with the times as we've moved forward.
They did use he as the default pronoun here and there, which kind
Oh,
of
they do?
raised my
Really?
eyebrow. Yeah,
Wow, I did not know. Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
It
Okay.
stood out to me because White Wolf like was so,
Yeah, they were
you
so.
know, front and center about we're using she as our default, and that was like a
Oh,
thing. And then here it's like, oh, I guess they didn't.
that's a little disappointing, huh?
Not everywhere, but they certainly used it multiple times. Some writer didn't get the memo.
As for the core book split, while it would be nice to just have all of the rules in a single book if the only thing you're interested in is that one game line, I do love the divide because I am glad that it saves space for just the unique stuff in another game line.
Hmm.
And I also think that the overall lessons that they're trying to give you in this game book are generally applicable to what you get from the other game lines, and the other ones build upon it. So I feel like this gave a good foundation for that.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, speaking of unique stuff in the individual game lines, next time we'll be talking about the Changeling the Lost First Edition core book. So we'll have
Haha!
ample opportunity to dive into that.
It has been a while since I have read the 1E core book.
Yeah,
This
same.
is this is going to be an experience.
Well, in the meantime, I'm going to take us into our outro. If you are interested in conversing with us, joining the conversation with other listeners, etc., you can reach out to us on Discord at discord.me/CTP. Send an email to podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. We're on Facebook and YouTube under Changeling the Podcast. Our Mastodon account is dice.camp/@changelingpod, which I can never figure out how to say that. And then on Patreon, Changeling the Podcast. By the time this episode goes out, we may also have a Blue Sky. It will be, along with the rest of these links, in the show notes to this episode. And I think that pretty much does it for now. So,
Anyway, yeah, it's been awesome.
yeah. So I've been Puka.
And I've been Fetch.
And until next time, I'm going to have to come up with something else, but keep on dreaming for now. Here at Changeling the podcast, we like to imagine how previous drafts of the new world of darkness might have unfolded, and cobble together those possibilities into strange and wonderful alternatives to the alternative. Imagine, if you will, additional virtues like stick-to-itiveness, and vices like dirtbaggery, or perhaps new derived attributes such as gumption or swole. What if first edition Awakening mages had a connection not to the lost continent of Atlantis, but instead the fabled realm of Funky Town, or if the gentry hailed from Snarkadia and were correspondingly sassy? It's also a little-known fact that rather than ghosts, the original supernatural antagonist option in the corebook was an early form of Promethean, namely golems made of discount macaroni. These and other musings are the kind of thing that we do with the support of our patrons, so we'd like to shout them out a thank you, and they are Derek, Dorcadus, Elleris, Iabel, Jason Vines, Oreo, Raskaboos, Sandjigger, Sija, Simon Strand, and Victor Torrey. Thanks to you all. Stop by www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast if you'd like to sign up and get similar shoutouts. But we also appreciate reviews on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience. Check out the links in the show notes to this episode to get in touch with us, and even if you don't, we wish you well in your explorations, encouraging you, as always, to keep on dreaming.